The rain fell like judgment, cold and unrelenting, washing the city in silver and shadow. Sirens screamed in the distance, a haunting lullaby for the guilty. In the back seat of a black sedan, Marco's reflection trembled against the window, eyes like stone, heart like thunder. His gloved hands rested on the weapon that had ended countless lives, but tonight, it weighed differently. Tonight, the enemy had a face he could never forget. For 10 years, Marco stood behind the city's most feared man, the boss. He was his shadow, his shield, his silence. Every secret the boss buried, Marco buried deeper. Every betrayal, he erased. He'd taken bullets meant for another man, lied in the name of loyalty, and killed in the name of honor. To the world, he was a ghost in a suit, to the boss, he was family. But even ghosts have hearts, and his had begun to remember. There was a code he lived by: protect. Obey. Never question. It had kept him alive in a world where mercy meant weakness. Yet tonight, that code felt like a noose tightening around his throat. The boss had made his decision, swift, merciless, final. A name on a folded paper. A face captured under fluorescent light. A target he was expected to erase. Her name was Elena. His sister. The one person Marco swore to protect, even from himself. She didn't know what he'd become, the monster shaped by loyalty, the weapon disguised as a man. In her eyes, he was still the boy who swore he'd never let the streets take him. But the streets always take what they're owed. And tonight, they wanted her. He stared at the photograph, edges trembling between his fingers. She looked older now, worn by time and kindness. She didn't belong in his world, never did. He wanted to throw the photo away, but loyalty had its claws in his soul. The boss's voice echoed in his head, calm and deadly: family ends where loyalty begins. The city stretched before him, glittering like broken glass. Every light was a secret. Every shadow, a sin. Marco knew once he stepped out of that car, there was no going back. Not to innocence. Not to forgiveness. Only to blood. He loaded the gun, his reflection watching him like a stranger. Duty or blood? Honor or heart? Every choice left someone bleeding. He'd killed for loyalty, but could he kill for love? Outside, the rain grew heavier, drowning the sound of his heartbeat. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell tolled midnight. The city waited, holding its breath for the shot that would decide its fate. And in that silence, one question lingered like smoke over a dying flame. What happens when the man who protects becomes the traitor? I have watched Marco move through that city for years, like a shadow that learned to breathe in the same rhythm as the streets. He is never the headline, he is the margin note, the quiet punctuation at the end of a violent sentence. You see him open doors with a practiced, unremarkable motion: car doors, iron gates, the heavy oak of clubrooms where deals are struck beneath the sickly glow of chandeliers. You see him stand behind the boss at every meeting, a silent silhouette whose breathing fills the spaces other men leave empty. His eyes do the talking, scanning, measuring, cataloging threats the way some men collect newspapers. He does not speak much because the world he inhabits is built on silence. Words are currency squandered. His loyalty is not announced with speeches or medals. It is a small, relentless ritual performed every day, a hand on a shoulder that steadies, a step in front of a bullet that would otherwise find a different name. For 10 years that ritual has been his identity, until identity and obligation begin to rub against each other and wear a raw place on his soul. I have seen that where light seldom reaches. His childhood was a collage of small cruelties and cold rooms, an orphanage with a radiator that clanked like an old clock, other boys who sharpened fists and taught him how to hide bruises, a hunger that shaped the hollows under his cheekbones. There was a particular winter when he was 12 and the city seemed especially hungry. He fought for bread and lost more than he expected. The memory of that night is a notch he will always carry. He remembers the smell of frying oil and the sound of a bottle breaking, and then a pair of hands larger than his own scooping him from the gutter. The man who would become the boss did not adopt him from sentiment, he adopted him because a loyal man is useful. The boss taught Marco how to survive with style and cruelty, how to move without being seen, how to make a threat be felt before a word is spoken, how to keep secrets like weapons. The boss saved his life and, in doing so, forged a chain whose links Marco would polish until his knuckles bled. In the boss's world, loyalty is a religion and Marco was ordained young. The boss's rooms are ritual spaces, candlelight that makes eyes glisten like coins, cigar smoke that cloaks the faces of men making plans that will cost blood. Deals are done with measured laughter, with glasses raised, with hands that hide knives beneath suits. There is an architecture to violence here, the boss at the head of the table, the underboss with his ledger of favors, lieutenants who manage territory like plantation managers, and Marco, who stands at the threshold between safety and catastrophe. He is the invisible margin that keeps their writing legible. Respect for the boss is a muscle Marco flexes without thinking. For a long time it felt like love. He has watched the boss cradle defeated men like trophies, listened when he spoke about legacy as if it were a poem. But the muscle has begun to cramp. Once, on a night when the city felt tired even of itself, Marco slipped into a quiet church that folds itself between a pawn shop and a noodle stand. He did not kneel to pray so much as to be counted among the faceless, he lit a candle for a name he did not say aloud. There, among the cracked stained glass and a scent of old wax, the armor softened, just a little. The candle flare reflected in his pupils like a small, private confession. He does not tell the boss about such things. The code of silence he follows is more faithful than any marriage vow: protect, obey, never question. It has kept him breathing when the world tried to close its fist around his throat. But codes bend under pressure. There are moments when the past, like a returning tide, begins to wash away the careful sandcastles of the present. Elena is that tide. He has not seen her in years, years in which her life and his have run parallel but never touching. She runs a small clinic on the wrong side of the tracks, a place of threadbare curtains and mismatched bandages, where people who would otherwise be invisible find someone who will stitch them back into the world. She does not know the kind of hands her brother keeps clean by making sure other hands get dirty. When they meet again the first time in a long while, it is not a cinematic reunion, it is brittle and awkward, two people trying on memories like old coats. She says, with a tenderness that cuts, "You're the man with no soul." He wants to explain that the soul is a luxury he could not afford, that survival asked for everything. Instead he watches her move through the clinic, how her fingers steady, how she talks to a child about stitches as if it were a story. There is warmth under her accusation. There is also the knowledge that she could never belong to his world, her hands are made for healing, not for closing wounds with bullets. He keeps that knowledge to himself, because his life is a store of things he cannot give back. The inciting incident, the pivot upon which stories like these hang, arrives with the subtlety of a guillotine. A deal with a rival gang implodes, voices escalate, phones go silent, then glass breaks in a place where men used to laugh. The streets feel the change like a weather front. A leak is discovered, the sort of betrayal that cannot be tolerated in a house built of loyalties. The punishment in this city is swift and glacial at once: find the traitor, kill them, make the lesson visible. The boss speaks the words with a flatness that makes them heavier: find the traitor. Kill them. There is no deliberation, only motion. That night the boss hands Marco a folder, thin, unassuming, the kind of object that can end a life. Marco opens it with the ritual patience that has kept him alive, expecting a ledger, a name, a face. Inside there is a photograph. Elena's face stares up at him, the light catching her cheek as if she were in sunlight rather than print. The edges of the paper whisper between his fingers. For the first time in a life measured in steady hands and steady breaths, his own hand trembles. It is a small physical betrayal that betrays greater ones. A man whose body has been a promise feels the promise break. The city outside the window keeps moving, indifferent, as if nothing has changed. But for Marco everything has. The loyalty that built him is now the hand that could kill what he loves. The seed of the choice, the one that will split his world into before and after, has been planted, and the root is already eager to crack the pavement. I have watched the slow, inevitable way a man can begin to unravel and called it many things: fatigue, guilt, the erosion of a creed, but what this was looked more like a quiet mutiny, a rebellion that grew in the places where light dared to touch him. After the photo, Marco did what he had always done when the world demanded answers: he went to work. Only now his work split in two directions, like a road that forks and refuses to choose its name. By day he was still the ghost in a suit, the steady silhouette behind the boss, the man whose presence made other men think twice before coughing up truths they weren't ready to share. He opened the boss's doors, he scanned rooms, he kept his hand close to the small of his back where a pistol lay like a second heartbeat. But at night he became someone else, an agent of furtive kindness, a thief of secrets who took things not to sell but to bury. He hid the order. He told no one. He folded the paper and slid it into the lining of his jacket, against the old scar on his chest where a bullet once had tried to end a life he had not yet learned to call his own. He did not tell the underboss, who took pride in the boss's wrath. He did not tell the lieutenants, who catalogued loyalty in the sharp ledger of favors. He did not even tell the friendliest of the boss's men, because in a house built of secrecy, every confession is a spark that will set more than you intend alight. Instead, Marco set himself to investigate, and that investigation was a work of patience and bruises. He began where most men with nothing to lose begin, with questions that never sound like they will change anything. Who had been near Elena the week the deal collapsed? Who made calls at the hours she said she was stitching a wound? He visited clinics under the pretense of delivering supplies, lingered in the lobby of her building with the practiced stillness of a statue, and watched the comings and goings as if cataloging a gallery of possible betrayals. Every clue, every stray piece of information, seemed to point not outward but inward, deeper into the boss's own circle. A ledger entry misfiled, a name that turned out to be an alias for a man who took orders directly from inside the boss's office, a courier who preferred midnight streets, small threads that, when pulled, disclosed seams stitched with lies. The deeper Marco dug, the more the web looked less like an enemy snare and more like a map of family collusion. This was the cruel geometry of power. The people closest to the head often fed it with what it needed to stay alive, and that nutrient was sometimes betrayal wrapped in a promise. He brought what he could find back to the boss in the quiet hours before dawn, hiding his trembling hands under the table as if the act of presentation could cloak his doubt. The boss took the reports with an easy smile that did not bend his eyes. He is clever, I thought, because men who are loved rarely see how often they are used. The boss started to notice a change in Marco's gait, in the way his eyes lingered on certain faces, and the notice turned to strategy. In a world where suspicion is currency, the boss began to test his most valuable asset. He fed Marco false information, names that were not real, stories with holes so large a crow could have flown through. He watched for flinches, for hesitations, for the slight way the man's jaw tightened. He turned jokes into traps, casual remarks into acid tests. Marco, who had once worn silence like armor, found himself living under microscopes he could not always see. The tests were as subtle as a pinprick and as painful as artillery. The boss arranged a meeting where he mentioned Elena in passing, dramatizing her attendance at a charity function she never attended. He sent a courier who claimed to have seen Elena with a rival's lieutenant, details vivid, plausible, and poisonous. Marco heard it all and felt each lie like a stone in his pocket. He learned to answer with the economy of a man who knows breath must be rationed. Marco's life bifurcated. By day he moved in the daylight necessary for survival, the bodyguard who stood like a promise behind the boss. By night he scoured the city for truth, slipping into back alleys, speaking briefly with pharmacists who remembered faces, with taxi drivers who remembered routes. He found witnesses who saw Elena tending to a man with a red sleeve, officers who noted a vehicle parked outside the clinic at odd hours. But the eye that watches is not always the one that sees the heart. The trail led to men Elena had tended not because she conspired but because mercy is contagious in the most unlikely of neighborhoods. She had stitches in her hands, the sort that come from practice and not from violence. When Marco finally confronted her, an old, urgent thing in his voice she didn't recognize, she did not collapse into confessions. She told him plainly that she had been treating wounded men from the rival faction, and not as an emissary or a spy but because she could not turn them away. She said, "I saw a child with a bullet in his leg and I fixed him, Marco. I fixed him because he was bleeding, and that's what you do when someone is on your doorstep." Her face carried the quiet exhaustion of a person who had learned to bear other people's pain because she had no other way to keep herself together. Marco heard the words and felt them like a blade and a bomb at once. He wanted to believe her because the truth of her explanation soothed something raw and root-deep within him. He wanted to believe her because not to believe her would mean committing a sin he could not name. But in the boss's arithmetic, compassion is often indistinguishable from treachery. The boss would never accept Elena's innocence because the boss did not operate on mercy. The boss operated on order. To the boss, a wound tended is a ledger entry, kindness is a ledger that must be balanced. Marco realized then that his allegiance had been priceless and now it was being spent against his own blood. The loyalty that had once felt like faith began to rot into guilt, the slow, putrid erosion that turns what once was noble into something ugly and inexplicable. It lived in the syllables of his sleep, in the way his hands shook when he touched the cold metal of his gun. His world narrowed to an axis of two commands: protect the boss, protect Elena. But those commands pulled in opposite directions, like tectonic plates grinding slowly and inexorably toward a fault line. He tried to reconcile them with small rebellions, he planted false evidence to mislead any who would seek it, he redirected a courier, he withheld facts in reports. Each act of deception felt like a theft of himself. Yet the more careful he was, the more elaborate the boss's countermeasures became. The tests increased in frequency and cruelty. One night, a message arrived at the house, a single line that read simply, "Do it. Tonight." It was the boss's voice in ink, the absolute authority of an order that did not wait for explanation. Marco understood the meaning before he finished reading. Tonight Elena would be marked, tonight a clean, efficient erasure would take place. He stood outside her apartment with the rain making small drummers of the streetlights. The world had shrunk to the size of his palm and the weight of the gun he held. Through the window, he saw her, Elena, kneeling, a child on her lap, a bandage wrapped around a trembling thigh. She hummed a tune under her breath, an old lullaby from their mother, the kind of sound that can make a man remember what he once was. The gun felt hot and heavy against his skin. The rationalizations he had rehearsed over and over, duty, loyalty, the preservation of a system he had once believed in, felt suddenly thin and false. He could see, with a clarity that was cruel, the geometry of consequences. Pull the trigger and he would save the boss's system at the cost of something human and unreplaceable. Lower the gun and he would be a traitor, with a target now painted not just on a photograph but on his back. He lowered the weapon. The rain turned the street into a mirror that reflected his face as he stood there, an unmoored man in a world of iron certainties. It was his first betrayal, a word that clumsily failed to capture the internal revolution blooming like frost along warm glass. He imagined the moment the boss would learn of his hesitation, the revenge that would unfurl like a black petal. He imagined the men who did not know him as a brother but as a tool, and how they would sharpen their knives in the dark. Then, in the seed dark between heartbeats, the reality that had been hiding like a crouched animal revealed itself. Someone was watching. I saw the moment the world changed for Marco as clearly as one might observe a house catch fire, at first a shimmer, then the slow, inevitable unspooling of what had been thought steady. The boss did not rage, he rarely raged. He orchestrated. He was a conductor who made violence sound like music. When the footage surfaced, a small, grainy feed from a hidden camera in a back alley where a courier had been careless, the boss watched it with the same calm patience he used to clip his fingernails. The camera didn't lie. It showed what the printed photo hinted at and what Marco's hands had told him in the dark: a man with a gun lowering it, a hesitation that lasted a breath too long, the face behind the window, the child, the bandage. The sequence repeated on a pale monitor as the boss's men filtered in, their faces folding into the square of light. They watched the act of mercy like jurors viewing a crime. The boss let the reel play twice. He did not need more. He folded his hands as if he were listening to a history lesson. "You had one job, son," he said, his voice soft and present tense, the way a teacher speaks when he will flunk a child for the final time. It was not an accusation so much as an arithmetic fact. There was a ledger, and Marco's hesitance had been added to the wrong column. Marco stood before him like a man who had been caught not in the act of betrayal but in a moment of weakness the boss had the right to correct. He did not speak. The silence was not defiance, it was a deeper kind of recognition that words here only gilded guilt. The boss's nod was small and deliberate. It set things into motion, 2 small gestures, and the machinery of punishment hummed to life. Men at the edges straightened, exchanged subtle glances that handled weapons as if they were delicate instruments. The world had shifted its axis and, for Marco, the ground had begun to tilt. He left the room without the dignity of an answer, because honor in that house was a currency he no longer had. The street swallowed him, and for a while he moved only because he knew how to move, quietly, with purpose, padding through alleys as if the city itself were an accomplice keeping secrets. He could not stay where he was exposed. The boss's order, unsaid and yet absolute, hung like a noose. He had been loved, then used, then measured, and finally judged by the man who had made him. That evening, the city's night air felt thin and metallic, as though someone had replaced the usual smells of oil and fried food with the scent of a knife blade. Marco moved toward Elena's clinic because that was where the fracture had started. He moved there because he hoped, irrationally, that the familiar would stitch the unreasonable back into place. He pushed open the clinic door and found her under a single lamp, tending to a man who looked older than the years his face suggested. Elena's face lit up like paper flame when she saw him, relief, surprise, a shred of accusation, and in that expression Marco thought he might die of the small thing. She ushered him into the back, where the smell of antiseptic mingled with old tea. He told her nothing of the camera or the order. He could not. It felt to him like telling a child about the calculations that go into losing a parent. The innocence of ignorance is sometimes a gift. But she saw him, really saw him, the hollows under his eyes, the way his mouth refused to form a smile, and she reached out with a hand that had always been able to find the spots where pain lived without asking to be taught. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said, the phrase heavier than she intended. He laughed, a short thing that snapped like a brittle twig. "I always have," he said. She tilted her head, and the room seemed to condense around them, a rawness, a history, a space where reconciliation might be possible. Then she told him something she had not meant to say aloud, something that would tilt the world again and make him understand the geometry of betrayal in its most complicated shape. She admitted, quietly, that she had tended to a man from the rival faction, a man who had come in with a wound that needed pressing and that had, for reasons she could not fully explain, trusted her hands. She had done what she had always done, pulled a thread, cleaned a wound, stitched skin together. She had not asked whether his politics were neat or violent. She had not thought of factions when a child's blood watered her palms. He was just a man who was bleeding, she said, voice small as if confessing something mundane instead of epical. She had not known he carried a recorder. She had not known that the man had filmed her hands, not because her hands were culpable but because he was afraid and wanted leverage. Marco felt the plane of the world bend. Betrayal here was not a single act but a kaleidoscope. Someone else, someone clever, someone cruel, had weaponized Elena's compassion and given it a face that could be framed and labeled as treachery. The revelation splintered the neat moral arithmetic that had been laid down for him by the boss. It revealed a truth that is always insidious, that the world is not composed of clean categories, loyal and traitorous, pure and corrupt, but is a messy ledger of unintended consequences. Marco wanted to take Elena's confession as a salve, a proof that the thing he had protected was worth protecting. Instead, it turned out to be an indictment he could not easily erase. He had been given a choice he had not chosen to make, to obey the boss and preserve the system that had given him purpose, or to preserve the blood of the only family he had left. He understood now that he could not save both. Whatever resolution he sought would be measured in loss, and that is a calculus managers of violence know and prefer. The boss wanted a simple ledger. Elena had offered complexity, which in the boss's eyes equated to risk. When Marco returned to the boss's house, if one can call a place where deals were settled, lives auctioned, and favors used a house, he did not come as a supplicant. He came as a man who knew the limits of supplication. The boss received him in a room whose decor reflected a life spent making compromises with taste: heavy curtains, a rug that swallowed footsteps, portraits of men who had once mattered. The boss's face was the same as ever, composed, unreadable, but there was a new shadow in his eyes, a hint of a personal hurt that belonged more to a father learning a son had failed a test than to a criminal lord assessing liability. "You protected her," the boss said. It was not a question. Marco's throat moved, and for the first time in a long while he felt the shame of human frailty not as an abstract pain but as a weight pressing on his ribs. He tried to explain Elena's confession, to outline the accident of a man with a recorder, to render into narrative the way mercy had been manipulated. The boss listened as if hearing about weather patterns, interested but unmoved. "Blood doesn't buy forgiveness," he said finally, a sentence that landed like a verdict. It was the most human line I had ever heard from him, if one can say that a sentence that kills is human. The boss's meaning was clear: familial ties did not absolve one of failures, proximity to love did not protect you from the ledger. Marco fell to his knees not because of the cinematic shame of supplication but because the meaning of the boss's sentence revealed an arithmetic beyond his ability to absorb. The only way to be forgiven in that world was to reprove your value. Forgiveness was not a grace but a transaction. He offered himself. What else does one offer when all other currency is gone? He said he would fix the error. He said he would find a way to unmake the stain. He said, in the desperate voice of a man trying to hatch a miracle out of nothing, "Let me." The boss held up a hand. "You made your choice when you hesitated," he said. "Choices cost. That is how the world keeps balance." Then the room filled with men who had the look of those who make sure that balance tips correctly. Doors closed. The air became a file being stamped. Marco realized then that pleading might only make the machinery sharper, that bargains often only enmesh you deeper. His mind, which had grown practiced at heading off disaster by quick movement and quicker thinking, now tried on strategies like ill-fitting coats. Could he fake Elena's death to satisfy the boss? Could he stage a disappearance? Could he exile himself and leave Elena to the possibility of life? Each plan he sketched unraveled quickly under scrutiny. Forged deaths were messy and smelled of deceit. Exile would make Elena vulnerable. Pretending was a language the boss's men spoke fluently. The options were poor. The clock moved, indifferent, and time in that house had the strange quality of both standing still and accelerating, like a heartbeat measured by algorithm. The emotional twist, the thing that makes stories unspool into human ache, was not merely that he had to choose but that the choice would require him to enact the very violence his entire being had been trained to prevent in the most intimate of deaths. He would have to become the instrument of the boss's justice against the person whose breath he had sworn to guard. He thought of his hands, the ones he had used to hide a gun, to steady a man through a surgery of both medicine and violence, to light candles in the dark. He thought of Elena's hands, which sewed life back together and hummed lullabies between stitches. How many ways can hands be instruments? The answer arrived as a thought that tasted like rust, enough to sever a family. In the hollow between plan and action, Marco confronted the man who had raised him. Not as a child seeking absolution but as a soldier demanding mercy for a family member. He spoke plainly, not in the soft apologies he once mastered, but with a clarity that cut through the boss's veneers. He told the story, the man with the recorder, Elena's ignorance of his intent, her method of healing that had never considered politics. He offered himself up as a corrective. "Take me instead," he said. The boss's reply was not surprise, it was a lesson. "Blood doesn't buy forgiveness," he repeated. "You trade a life because you suddenly value the life of someone you previously valued less than the system." There was contempt there, and also a wounded pride that this loyal instrument had become sentimental. "You made your choice," the boss said, and in those 5 words he closed the ledger. Marco felt the floor tilt more sharply. He had known for a long time that the day might come when his loyalty and his blood would be at cross purposes. He had imagined scenarios in which sacrifice might reconcile the two. He had not imagined being the sacrificial lamb. The consequence of his hesitation had been calculated and, to the boss, corrected. The boss's men prepared for execution with a thoroughness that was clinical. They catalogued outcomes like an accountant listing assets. Marco watched the faces of those he had once protected, men whose loyalty he had assumed as steady as stone, now study him as if he were a problem to be solved. In the theater of the house, there was no curtain call left for him, only a script that demanded an ending. He thought, for a child's second, of running, of dissolving into alleys, of changing his face, of vanishing into a world that did not keep ledgers. But he knew the city. It is not so kind to men who turn their backs. Escape was for those without blood to protect, for those who could afford to vanish. He had a sister whose hands still hummed lullabies, and that tether made escape a coward's argument. Something in him snapped, not like a dramatic flick but more like the quiet breaking of a hinge that had long rusted under use. He understood, with a clarity that felt monstrous, that to save Elena he might have to do what the boss expected of him, become the traitor the boss's justice claimed to protect the system from. The truth is never clean, it is paid for in decisions that cleave the self into pieces. Marco's feet moved in the way they had always been trained to move, with certainty, directness, the economy of action that had kept men alive and men dead. He made arrangements in the space of an hour that would have once seemed impossible, calls whispered in the dark, alliances brokered with men he had once considered merely functions of the boss's will. He decided, then, on a plan so dangerous it felt like prayer, to make the boss's justice an act that would instead free Elena, to make the ledger show a different casualty. He would become what he had sworn never to be, a betrayer of the boss, so that blood, in another calculation, could be saved. The moral calculus had inverted, his loyalty would now be used against the very institution that had forged him. In that pivot was the deepest kind of irony. The only way to save love was to violate a loyalty he had sanctified. When dawn approached, the city did not notice the small human insurgency brewing in the shadows. It continued to sell its wares, to heat its soup, to watch its soaps. But inside the rooms where men made hard decisions, a new ledger had been opened in a single man's chest. Marco had to become the thing he swore to protect the boss from, a man capable of choosing blood over order, family over empire, and in doing so he made peace with the knowledge that there would be no coming back from the act. The decision was made, and with it came the fierce, aching clarity that sometimes the truest betrayals are acts of love. The last meeting felt, from the moment Marco arranged it, like a theater where every stagehand knew their cue except him. He said it beneath the pretense of surrender because surrender is a language the boss trusted, it fit the ledger, the arithmetic of obedience. He called in favors that had once seemed petty and used them like coins, an old lieutenant who still owed him a quiet kindness, the door unlocked with a practiced click. He chose a room that had seen fewer deaths than most in that house, a study lined with books that smelled faintly of tobacco and old paper, the kind of room the boss used to receive men who were to be let go with dignity. The irony was a bitter seasoning. He wanted the optics of surrender, his hands visible, his posture humble, the shape of a man who would accept the blade without drama. The boss would like that. The boss would approve the ritual and, in approving it, would lower his guard enough for what had to be done. Elena was hidden nearby, behind a curtained alcove in the downstairs parlor, a place where she could be close enough to run in and claim the scene as her own if things went wrong, but far enough to be unseen until the moment came. She had insisted on being there, insisting that whatever happened, she would not be kept in the dark as if her life were a thing to be bartered. Marco had argued, but he knew in the way he had always known things, by the feel of their edges, that her presence would be the needle of conscience he needed. The boss arrived with his usual retinue, 2 lieutenants who looked as if they had been carved from the same stone, a younger man who watched everything with hungry, useful eyes, and the underboss, whose ledger of favors was thicker than the boss's own patience. They walked in like a storm, the air shifted with the authority of people who had decided. Marco stood when they entered, the room smaller somehow, the air more crowded with possibility for violence. He folded his hands in front of him, fingers touching in a gesture meant to be disarming, and he remembered every lesson the boss had taught him about posture and apology. He let his shoulders slump just enough to read as contrition and let his eyes avoid the boss's until the man spoke. "You know why you're here," the boss said, his voice not loud so much as absolute. Marco did not answer. He had learned that the first words after a sentence like that tend to be bargaining, and bargaining was language the boss used to win pity from fools. Marco knelt when the boss motioned, a deliberate, humiliating gesture that looked exactly like surrender. He let his forehead lower in a manufactured script of regret, and he felt, beneath the act, the old muscle memory of obedience. He wanted the boss to think he had been broken by the revelation, that the man had returned to the fold with the humility of a penitent. The room hummed as if the very walls had tuned themselves to listen for what would come next. For a suspended heartbeat, everything was as the boss expected, Marco humbled, the boss righteous. Then Marco moved. It was not a sudden, cinematic lunge but a clean, premeditated slash of motion that had been rehearsed in his mind so often that it felt like a memory. He rose not to flee but to strike, to wrench the narrative from the boss's hands and force it into a different geometry. The strike was fast and precise, an instrumented violence that bore the tradecraft of a man who had spent a life standing between death and a man who wanted to be immortal. He aimed not to slit a throat for vengeance but to disable, to create confusion, to open a seam where chaos could breathe. The first 2 shots were surgical, aimed at the lieutenants who had been closest, the men who would have moved first. In the theater of the room, the sound was a percussion that made the books shiver on their shelves. Then guns spoke and the study erupted. The lieutenants returned fire with the reflex of trained animals, the younger man dove for cover, his eyes wide with the realization that the play they had expected had been rewritten. The underboss rolled, the carpet beneath him taking the color of spilled wine and something darker. Marco moved through the firing like a man walking through a storm prepared for every gust. Pain bloomed as bullets found flesh, sharp ice blooming under skin, but he paid attention only to the choreography, where to step, whom to disarm, which moments to steal time. The room fractured into shouting voices and the battering rhythm of gunfire as the boss's men fought to restore order to an order they thought immutable. Elena, hidden beneath the curtain, heard the first shots and then the scrambling, and she did not wait for permission. She came out not as a hostage but as a presence, a small woman with a determined face and hands that had always been used to mending. She ran through the chaos because she could not stand the thought of men she loved being instruments of each other's death. Her presence was not the decisive force, guns were, but it was the human factor that shifted probability. She moved toward Marco, calling his name with a sound that cut through the din like wind through reeds, and in that sound he felt the world become a little smaller and a little more bearable. In the frenzy, one of the boss's men, a young enforcer who had never thought himself capable of murder but had been taught that survival demands it, took aim at Elena. For a second the actor was a silhouette, an impulse behind a weapon. Marco saw the arc of the intended bullet and felt the muscles of his body contract in a response older than guilt, protect. He thrust himself between the bullet and his sister, and the world narrowed to the shrink-wrapped instant of a decision. Pain lanced him across the shoulder. He heard the wet, undeniable sound of impact and the animal cry that follows when flesh is surprised by metal. He fell, and for a moment the gunfire was not as loud. He saw Elena's face, horrified, then furious. She screamed, and that scream is the kind that rearranges the rhythm of hearts. The battle turned then into something more chaotic. The boss's men swore and focused on those who had tried to betray the order, and Marco's people, if one could call the contingent of men who had followed him friends, rallied with a desperation that is both brave and reckless. The fight was not noble, it was graceless and efficient, full of the kind of ugliness that war teaches beyond books. Bodies slumped, and the carpet soaked in blood that no one could put back into the veins of those men. Marco crawled toward the boss across the ruined carpet even as the world narrowed and the edges of his vision blurred. He did not crawl to finish a sentence, he crawled because the boss still existed like a wound needing closure. The boss stood, wounded by not only a bullet but by the affront, by the sharp proof that the system could be subverted even from within. He was not cleanly harmed, his pride, more than his body, was wounded. He lifted his hand not for rhetorical flourish but with the real intention of finishing what his men had not. Their confrontation was the thing that the entire city had been leaning toward without knowing it. They faced each other in a landscape of overturned furniture and the smell of burning powder. The boss reached for a pistol and fired. Marco fired. It was a dialogue in bullets, accusation met answer. The boss's voice cut through the firing, raw now. "You were my son," he said, and in those words he poured years of mentorship into a last attempt at moral claim. Marco, bleeding and exhausted and so tired of being the price of a balance, replied not with anger but with the simple, devastating truth that had kept him awake for nights: "You made me forget I had a sister." The line landed like an invocation, the recognition that the boss's care had been conditional, focused on fidelity to an institution that ate people for nourishment. The boss staggered, whether from pain or surprise or the weight of the sentence was not clear. Marco saw him as he had been taught to see him before obedience had alternately shielded and varnished their relationship, a man who made choices in which his son was an instrument. The final shot came not with the grandeur of fate but with the small, clean brutality of consequence. Whether Marco pulled the trigger or it was the recoil of their collision is a detail that matters less than the meaning. One man died in the arms of the person he had taught to be obedient. The boss's eyes, usually mirrors reflecting no one, softened in the last heartbeat, and then closed. He fell into Marco's arms as if being taken into a benediction. There was no scream, no grand speech, only the wet, real sound that the end of a life often makes, a breath that stops mid-sentence and then no more. Elena calved into the space between them, her face a mirror of horror and grief. She knelt, hands spreading to a place where life had been and would not be again. She sobbed, not theatrical, but whole, the sound of someone who had been tearing wounds closed and was then asked to face the wound as it opened. Marco felt the weight of the boss in a new and awful intimacy. The man had been his maker, his captor, his patron, and now his corpse. The paradox of their relationship settled on him like ash. Around them the surviving men fell silent as the adrenaline thinned and comprehension set in. The ledger had been cleaved, and the cost was a body that had once been a bulwark. Marco, bloodied and human, tried to stand and failed. The world tilted. He had no hands steady enough to staunch the boss's wound, he was the instrument that had performed the end. He had kept his sister alive, and in that act had shattered the edifice that had kept his life legible. The cost of his choice was more than the boss's life. It was the life of the order that had sustained thousands and destroyed more. It was also the death of the man he had been, a shell of obedience that now had to reckon with what conscience looked like when it surfaced from below duty. In the hush that followed, the city continued its indifferent music beyond the windows, a late engine, a dog barking, the soft sluice of rain. Inside the room, Elena's hands trembled as she touched the boss's face, as if checking that the thing was not only dead but real. She looked at Marco with a look that held accusation, love, bewilderment, and invitation, an offer for a life rebuilt from ruin if he would accept it. Marco met her eyes and saw in them a future unmade. He wanted to take that future but feared the price. He had been everything to the boss. Now he had no one left under that particular definition. The men who remained in the house gathered weapons and faces full of calculation. Some moved toward flight, some toward the grim business of covering tracks, some toward the bitter complacency of a world that insists violence be repaid with violence. Marco watched them as if from a distance and felt the numbing truth: there were no winners here, only survivors who would have to explain themselves to history or to themselves. The room smelled of smoke and iron and something that tasted like repentance. Elena held Marco's hand, and in that grip he felt the coolness of living, the fact that choices bleed but also the fact they can sometimes save. He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them the faces around him were not carved like dead statues but fluid, human, fallible. The destruction of loyalty had not produced triumph but an ache that might birth a different kind of conscience, one that would have to walk among the ruins and decide what to do with the power that remained. I have watched how cities swallow stories, how they blot out the small human combustions that once seemed like everything. After the last shot, after the boss fell and the rooms emptied of the immediate heat of violence, the house that had been a temple to order became a scene of messy human aftermath: men counting losses, men burning papers, men arranging narratives. Marco did not stay to be catalogued. He could have been taken, tried, displayed, or quietly executed, but he chose instead to dissolve into the city the way smoke leaves a closed room, without apology and without leaving a map. He disappeared the way a man with nowhere left to belong disappears, with steps measured not to be tracked, with the careful shedding of patterns that made him predictable. The streets accepted him because they always accept those who know their rhythms. He learned a different route through the alleys, took trains that moved in misaligned schedules, used the kindness of a small bar owner who had once owed him a favor, slept in places that smelled of other people's laundry and the same fear he carried. There were nights when he would stand at the edge of bridges and think about stepping into the river below, but something, usually a memory of Elena humming while she stitched, pulled him back from the edge. He lived in the folds of the city and in the half-lights of rooms paid for with cash left in pockets that nobody would miss. News travels slant in a place like this. The story of the boss's death bulged and folded into itself. Some people called Marco a traitor and spat his name like it was a curse. Others called him a hero and said his hands had finally chosen a conscience. The city's tongues are many and hungry. They will name the same action a salvation or a sin depending on what coin they hope to squeeze from the telling. Elena heard them all as she sat in the clinic, bandaging the same kinds of wounds that had once put her brother in impossible positions. She continued to open her doors each morning, to sweep the floor, to press lint-free strips over other people's cruelties. The clients who came to her were not interested in politics. They came for stitches and aspirin, for the kind of human tending that had no place in ledgers. The community around her warmed her with a curiosity that was gentle and often painful. Nobody asked directly about the boss or the man who had been his shadow, but everyone knew something had changed. Rumors threaded the waiting room. An old woman who sold fruit at the corner told stories about a man who saved children, and nearby a young man with a rifle nick in his lip said the same man had murdered a lord. Elena listened to both and smiled with a face that had learned to carry contradictions. Some nights she would sit with a cup of tea after the clinic closed and look at the photograph of Marco she kept folded in a book, less as a map than as a talisman, and whisper into steam that tasted like forgiveness and grief mingled. There are people who believe that if you stitch a wound often enough the fabric of your heart can mend, and there are others who say scars never stop being scars. Elena refused to choose between these philosophies. She lived by the practical: if someone needed her, she would not let them die on her doorstep. The city's morality is elastic, but it does not easily forgive those who break its old contracts. For Marco, the city's whispers were less important than the small windows into human life that occasionally opened for him. He watched Elena from places where he thought she would not see him, across a cafe where she drank weak coffee, at the edge of a market where she bought cheap tomatoes, from the shadow of a church where he once had lit a candle. He saw how she moved among people, how she gave the same tenderness to the cornered and the criminal. He saw how her hands trembled sometimes when she hummed a lullaby that used to belong to their mother. He watched not to control but because the watching was the only way he knew how to keep his promise, an odd, anonymous promise to be near without touching, to be a guardian who had traded a life of obedience for one of quiet stealth. Time, for him, moved in loops. He would go for weeks mixing sleeping pills with coffee and then erupt into sudden, unexpected bouts of activity where he performed errands for people he had never met. He sometimes found himself in churches at midnight, lighting tiny candles in memory of a man who had taught him how to survive and in memory of the brother he would never speak of to anyone with a ledger in his hand. The boss's death left a vacancy the city reacted to like a newly opened wound. Some opportunists moved in to take turf, some mourned with the antique grief of those who had been built by systems that used people to make them durable. The underboss, the one whose ledger had been thickest, retreated for a while to re-architect the order. Others raced to place their names near the empty chair. The world rearranged itself with the kind of efficiency that belongs to courtesans of chaos. For a while, there were threats. Men came looking for Marco, men with thin, persistent voices and promises to make him pay. Some were bluster, some were skill. He had friends still, men he had saved, men who had owed him favors for reasons other than loyalty. They moved to protect him in the immediate aftermath, but such alliances have short half-lives when the price of protection is the dissolution of an empire. Marco repaid debts as best he could, a bag of cash here, a favor returned there, a promise kept in small acts that did not require his name. But much of his time was not spent fending off pursuers, it was consumed by the quiet work of living with consequences. He held his own wound like a bell. When it rang, he knew the sound would travel and call other unmanageable things to him. The boss's burial was a muted affair in a private plot where the stones were neat and the soil compacted. A few people came, those who had been paid to mourn, those who had genuine affection for a leader who had kept them fed and frightened in equal measures. There were speeches thinly veiled as elegies. There were men who cried like men who had lost a father figure who had given them a language to talk about power. Marco did not attend the funeral. He could have attended and stood at a distance to watch the ritual that was meant to restore a moral order by performing grieving. Instead he lingered in the city where silence does the work of funerals for those who are not afforded epitaphs. The gravestone that bore the boss's name, plain, stilted, a type of permanence designed to outlast people, was visited by many. I have seen Marco approach that stone in the rain, the same rain that seemed to mark major decisions in his life, the same rain that had been present the night he hesitated. He moved with a small, private dignity, the body of a man who had been used to hiding, now choosing a place to be seen for reasons that were not spectacle but reckoning. He stood in front of the stone until his knees softened and he could no longer stand on his own designing feet. The inscription read like an argument, a name, a date, a claim on history written in letters that were meant to endure. Marco ran his fingers along the edge of the stone, feeling for the imperfections that would prove it had been made by people and not by fate. The wind braided with the sound of cars and distant barking dogs. Rain threaded down his coat. He whispered, whether into the stone or into the rain, it's a distinction he never expected to have to make, I kept my promise. Just not the way you wanted. The sentence was small, a concession and a triumph at once. It was an admission that the kind of loyalty he had practiced had been both useful and cruel, and that keeping a promise does not always look like obedience. It can look like disobedience when the heart rewrites the terms. The grave did not answer. Graves have no mouths, only the cold truth of their existence. Marco left the cemetery with gravel stuck to the soles of his shoes and the soggy weight of rain in his hair. He walked away because that is what men who have cut ties must do, remove themselves from the familiar scaffolding until a new structure either takes shape or one learns to live with only ruins. He walked into fog that rolled in from the river like an apology or a threat. Sometimes one cannot tell the difference. There are small things left unsaid that linger in corners and in the backs of drawers. Apologies never given, names never spoken, loves never named. Marco carried a small ledger of unsaid things with him, conversations he had wanted to have with the boss that would not be possible now because the boss no longer needed them, words to Elena that he was ashamed to say because shame does that, folds the most necessary sentences into unreadable paper. He had a map of the city in his head and also a map of the dead he had carried inside him. The knocking of guilt is not loud. It is a constant, soft percussion that eventually becomes the metronome of your days. Sometimes he slept. More often he walked. He would pass children playing in courtyards and feel a sting that was both sweetness and sorrow. He would hear the lullabies Elena hummed in the clinic and imagine them as small liturgies that might, in time, fix the cracks his violence had made. There were nights when he considered writing a letter to Elena, an offering of explanations and excuses and a plea for some future that might not require his blood to fertilize, but he never left the letter. The act of folding a page felt like presumed reconciliation, and he did not yet believe that any reconciliation could be asked for or given. The city continued its grind. Sometimes he thought the moral calculus would catch up with him in ways he could not foresee, that someone would come and make the history of his deeds raw and public, that courts or gangs or hungry media would turn his narrative into a spectacle. For the most part, such things happened in fits and starts, a revenge attempt foiled, a whispered rumor caught in a bar, a child who would not stop eating at Elena's clinic because she was kind. In the end, the story did not conclude with a sweeping justice or a tidy moral. There were too many people, too many livelihoods, too many small, private compromises for a single verdict to hold. The city is a democracy of selfish interests, and in that democracy history is often messy and unsatisfying. The final sound of the story, a last device, if you like, was not a grand capstone, it was a single gunshot heard far off in the night, the kind of sound that could be for him or against him, the kind of sound that made people look up and think of the fragility of being. He heard it and felt it like a signal the way a flock notices wind. He did not run toward it. He did not run from it. He kept walking. The story's end was not a shout but a hush, and in that hush the city's truths settled into place like dust. Some call him traitor, others hero, and both are right and both are wrong because human lives refuse the tidy categories we like to create for our comfort. I have watched men like Marco before, men who have been built of harsh orders and tender mercies, and the one thing that always remains is the residue of their choices. Loyalty, when it dies, leaves behind guilt that becomes its ghost, and that ghost follows you into cramped apartments and into sunlight. Marco learned what many do, that there is no easy absolution, that the ledger is carried within, and that sometimes the best a man can do is keep moving forward while bearing the weight of his own decisions. Elena continued to stitch, to hum, to make small mercies possible. Marco continued to move in the gray margins, an exile by choice and a seeker by necessity. The city kept its secrets, and people kept their small kindnesses. In a life built on complicated debts, these are the tiny, stubborn facts that persist. In a world built on loyalty, betrayal isn't the end. It's the beginning of truth. If this story struck something deep, if you've ever been torn between loyalty and love, share your thoughts below. Tell me what you would have done if you were Marco. Would you have chosen duty or blood? And if you want more stories where power, pain, and betrayal collide, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Because every story has a heartbeat. And sometimes, it bleeds.